On March 17, 1943, in a quiet wood-paneled office in Berlin, a German admiral held a report that seemed impossible. It was a single sheet of paper, just a summary of raw intelligence. But its contents were more explosive than a 1,000-pound bomb. The report did not describe a new superweapon. It did not describe a secret army. It described a factory, an American factory an ocean away, that was projected to soon be capable of producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. To the men of the German High Command, it sounded like a joke, a piece of American propaganda so absurd it was laughable. But to the spies who had risked their lives to gather the information, it was something else entirely. It was a death sentence written in numbers. It was the day they knew, with chilling certainty, that the war was lost. This is the story of the devastating truth that was too terrifying for Adolf Hitler to believe, and how the denial of a single fact helped seal the fate of the Third Reich. In the heart of the Nazi war machine, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was an oddity. As head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, he was a man who lived and breathed cold, hard facts. Unlike the fanatics in Hitler's inner circle, Canaris was old school, a career naval officer, a patriot from a different era. He saw the world not through the warped lens of ideology, but through the clear glass of strategic reality. His loyalty was to Germany. His duty was to provide the unvarnished truth, no matter how ugly. The Abwehr was a sprawling network of agents and analysts stretching across the globe, the eyes and ears of the German military. In the early years of the war, its work had helped enable blitzkrieg, fast victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. But by early 1943, the mood in Berlin was changing. The war was no longer a series of victory parades. The disaster at Stalingrad had been a brutal shock. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet war machine was grinding back with terrifying force. In North Africa, American and British forces were squeezing the life out of Rommel's famed Afrika Korps. The tide was beginning to turn, and yet at the very top, a dangerous sense of invincibility lingered. Hitler, holed up in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, was becoming more detached from reality. He was surrounded by yes-men who filtered out bad news and fed his delusions. He believed the German war effort was a matter of sheer will. The German soldier was superior. German science was unbeatable. Victory was destiny. Into this echo chamber of self-deception, Admiral Canaris was about to pour a bucket of ice-cold water. He understood the grim arithmetic of war. Modern warfare was not just a clash of armies, it was a collision of economies, a brutal equation of steel, oil, and aluminum. And from his perch at the center of a global intelligence web, he was starting to see numbers that terrified him. Numbers that suggested Germany was not just losing the production war. It was about to be buried by an industrial avalanche it could not even imagine. The intelligence did not arrive in a single flash. It crept in as a slow, growing dread, built from dozens of sources. It started as whispers picked up by German agents in neutral countries. A businessman, just back from the United States, spoke of a factory so vast it had its own weather. A diplomat in Washington reported on American production targets that seemed to have an extra zero. A Swedish engineer sent a coded message about an aircraft assembly line that moved with the speed of car manufacturing. Individually, you could dismiss these reports. Together, they formed a terrifying pattern. At Abwehr headquarters, Canaris's analysts laid all the scraps of information side by side. They all told the same story. They all pointed to one place: a massive industrial complex in Michigan called Willow Run. And they all made the same ridiculous claim that the Ford Motor Company was applying automobile mass production techniques to a 4-engine B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. The long-term goal was to roll one off the line not once a day, not once every few hours, but once every single hour. To the German mind, this was impossible. A B-24 Liberator was a beast. An 18-ton machine of aluminum and steel with more than 1 million individual parts. German factories, the pride of European engineering, took weeks, sometimes months, to produce a comparable heavy bomber like the Heinkel 177. The idea that the Americans, a nation mocked in Nazi propaganda as a chaotic, racially mixed society, could build such a complex weapon in 60 minutes was not just unbelievable, it was insulting. Canaris and his officers did the math. If the Americans could actually do this, 1 bomber an hour meant 24 per day, over 700 per month from a single factory. At the time, the entire German aircraft industry struggled to produce a fraction of that number in heavy bombers. The spies double-checked their sources. The information was vetted from multiple angles. Even Japanese naval attachés, Germany's own allies, were sending back reports on American production with a tone of sheer dread. The data was solid. But how could this be? How could a workforce filled with people the Nazis considered inferior women, African Americans, immigrants, and disabled workers achieve this? How could a messy democracy mobilize with such terrifying focus? In the Nazi worldview, strength came from racial purity and authoritarian control. America had neither. Therefore, the reports had to be lies, part of a massive deception campaign. The alternative was too horrible to face. It meant the war was no longer a contest of soldiers or generals. It was a war of factories. And if the March 1943 Willow Run report was even half true, it meant Germany had already lost. As one Abwehr officer put it, if these numbers are correct, then Germany has already lost the war. It is no longer a question of willpower. It is a question of mathematics. Half a world away, the impossible was becoming very real. On a stretch of farmland in Michigan, a monster had risen. It was the Willow Run bomber plant, the physical embodiment of what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. There was nothing like it on Earth. Designed by industrial architect Albert Kahn, the main building was a single room so vast it was called the most enormous room in the history of man. It stretched for more than half a mile. To avoid paying property taxes in 2 different counties, the assembly line had to make a bizarre 90-degree turn, with partially built bombers rotating on giant turntables. Workers nicknamed it the tax turn. But the real revolution was the philosophy inside. Henry Ford and his production chief, Charles Sorensen, made a bold promise. They would build airplanes the way they built Model Ts. The traditional aircraft industry scoffed. "You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight," one executive sneered. Ford and Sorensen proved them wrong. They deconstructed the B-24 into manageable sub-assemblies. Each section of the bomber was broken down into small, repetitive tasks. Each worker was trained to do one thing very well. One person drilled holes, another riveted a panel. Over and over and over, this allowed the plant's apprentice school to churn out thousands of new workers every week. And who were these workers? They were a direct contradiction of Nazi ideology. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 42,000 people. Nearly a third were women, the real-life Rosies operating rivet guns and welding torches. One of them, Rose Will Monroe, became a model for the famous Rosie the Riveter character. The workforce was a tapestry of America. Thousands were African American. Others were classified as disabled. All working side by side, they labored in shifts 6 days a week. Their collective effort was a relentless 24-hour hum. This was the mongrel society Hitler loved to mock. And it was about to outproduce the so-called master race at a rate that defied belief. The early months were rough. The plant earned the nickname "Will It Run?" But as 1943 rolled on, the machine hit its stride. Raw materials flowed in one end. At the other, an 18-ton bomber rolled out, wings ready for flight. This was not propaganda. It was a new kind of warfare, a war of industrial might. And America was unleashing a weapon the Third Reich had no answer for. While German scientists labored on futuristic rockets, America was perfecting its most devastating weapon of all, the assembly line. Armed with this truth, Admiral Canaris faced his greatest challenge. He had to penetrate the ideological fortress around Adolf Hitler. That wall of denial had an architect, the second most powerful man in Germany, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Göring was head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. A flamboyant First World War ace who saw himself as the ultimate authority on air power. He was also profoundly corrupt and deeply egotistical. More than anyone, Göring was responsible for the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility. When Canaris presented the Abwehr's findings on Willow Run, Göring's reaction was not concern. It was laughter. He dismissed the reports. "Americans cannot build airplanes," he sneered. "They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades." It was not just a joke. It was the perfect summary of the Nazi worldview. To them, Americans were a nation of shopkeepers and consumers. A decadent society of mixed races, they lacked the supposed discipline and martial spirit of pure Germans. The idea that such a culture could mass-produce a heavy bomber was, in Göring's mind, simply impossible. You can imagine how maddening this was for Canaris. He was presenting a mathematical certainty to a man living in fantasy. His agents had specifics: the half-mile assembly line, the specialized tools, the huge capital investment. Göring would not hear it. He and his inner circle had their own narrative. To question it was not just to doubt a report. It was to commit heresy. For Göring to accept the Willow Run numbers would mean admitting his own failure. It would mean acknowledging that his intelligence services had missed the most critical development of the air war, and that his Luftwaffe was about to be swept from the skies. So the report went nowhere. It was buried under Göring's ego. The wall of denial stood firm. Canaris was left holding a truth that could have reshaped strategy. But no one with power was willing to listen. The next step was the most dangerous: to bring the information to the one man who truly mattered, Hitler himself. Presenting facts in Hitler's headquarters was a strange and deadly business. Whether at the Berghof in the Alps or the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the atmosphere was oppressive and paranoid. Reality was whatever Hitler decreed it to be. Military briefings were less about strategy and more about reinforcing whatever the Führer wanted to believe. Into this theater of delusion, the facts from Willow Run were a ticking bomb. Hitler's view of the United States was a bizarre mix of contempt and fear. He saw it as a mongrel nation, crippled by racial impurity and controlled by Jewish financiers. When confronted with the Abwehr's projections of 1 bomber an hour, over 650 a month from a single plant, his reaction mirrored Göring's, but with more venom. For him, this was not just strategy, it was a personal insult to his ideology. The numbers were Jewish fantasies, he raged, propaganda designed to sap German will. His own armaments minister, Albert Speer, a man who truly understood production, would later admit in Allied captivity that if the Willow Run numbers were even half accurate, Germany was doomed. But to say that in Hitler's presence in 1943 would have been suicide, so the great confrontation never fully happened. It was a collision between fact and dogma. And in the Third Reich, dogma always won. The Admiral's warning was not just ignored. It was treated as a symptom of defeatism. The men who brought the truth were now seen as weak. Their patriotism was questioned. In Hitler's mind, the war was a test of will and blood, not of logistics. A single piece of paper representing the dangerous work of dozens of spies was brushed aside. It contained the most important strategic fact of the war. The enemy's industrial capacity was growing at a rate Germany could not hope to match. The decision was made not by formal order, but by sheer refusal to see. The truth was rejected. The spies were dismissed. The Admiral was sidelined. And in that moment of supreme ideological blindness, the fate of millions was bent in one direction. The consequences of that denial were inevitable. They arrived first as a distant rumble, then as a terrifying roar that filled the skies over the Reich. Believing their own propaganda, the German High Command made a series of disastrous choices. They continued to funnel resources into Hitler's pet projects, the Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket were technically impressive, but strategically limited. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter was a revolution, but it arrived too late and in too few numbers. They did not have time, because the prophecy of Willow Run was coming true. Through late 1943 and into 1944, the trickle of Allied bombers became a flood. The U.S. 8th Air Force began a relentless daylight bombing campaign. At its heart were the B-24 Liberators. The machines rolling off the line in Michigan were now blotting out the German sky. In February 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, an all-out assault on the German aircraft industry. Thousands of bombers, many from Willow Run, pounded factories across Germany. The Luftwaffe rose to defend the homeland and was systematically annihilated. German pilots, however brave, were simply overwhelmed. For every German fighter that went down, only a trickle of replacements arrived. For every American plane lost, 10 more were crossing the Atlantic. It was a brutal war of attrition, exactly what Canaris had foreseen. The cities Göring had promised would never be bombed were reduced to rubble. One Luftwaffe general, fed up with Göring's detachment, wrote in his diary, "The Reichsmarschall lives in fantasy. Yesterday, 1,000 American bombers destroyed Linz. He still insists they cannot have built so many aircraft." The B-24s that rolled out of the most enormous room in the history of man were now deconstructing the Third Reich piece by piece. They shattered factories, they tore up railways, they obliterated oil refineries. The German war machine, starved of fuel, began to grind to a halt. The seemingly unstoppable Wehrmacht was being pounded into submission by the output of a single factory its leaders had laughed at. What, then, happened to the man who tried to sound the alarm? For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the price of telling the truth was steep. As the war turned against Germany, his sober warnings marked him as a man not to be trusted. In Hitler's paranoid court, being a realist sounded a lot like being a traitor. His rivals in the SS saw the Abwehr as a nest of old-world aristocrats who lacked true Nazi fervor. They spied on him. They waited for a mistake. His accurate reports on American industry were not just dismissed. They were used as proof that he was spreading enemy propaganda. He was trapped. To do his job was to seem disloyal, but his opposition went deeper than cautious memos. Horrified by SS atrocities, Canaris used the Abwehr to shield members of the German resistance, including theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He quietly worked to keep Spain from joining the Axis, an act of sabotage that cost Hitler dearly. The final blow came after the failed July 20, 1944, plot to assassinate Hitler. The Gestapo investigation uncovered a vast network of opposition. Many trails led back to the Abwehr. Canaris was arrested. His personal diaries were found. They revealed the depth of his disdain for the regime he served. On April 9, 1945, in the last chaotic weeks of the war, the order came from a vengeful Hitler. At Flossenbürg concentration camp, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was executed by hanging after mistreatment and humiliation. It was a brutal end for the man who had seen the future with painful clarity. He was killed by the very regime he had tried to save from its own blindness. He delivered the message. For his trouble, he was erased. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the final numbers proved just how right he had been. The report that landed on his desk in March 1943 had not been exaggerated. If anything, it had understated the threat. At its absolute peak in 1944, Willow Run was producing a B-24 Liberator not every hour, but about every 63 minutes. By the time the last plane rolled off the line, Ford had built 6,972 complete B-24s at Willow Run and produced another 1,893 knockdown kits for assembly elsewhere. Think about that. A single American factory produced more four-engine heavy bombers than the entire German aircraft industry managed during the whole war. And that was just one plant. Across all its factories from 1940 to 1945, the United States produced more than 300,000 military aircraft. Germany, in the same period, produced around 94,000 combat aircraft. The American industrialist William S. Knudsen put it bluntly, "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible." The German failure to believe this was not a failure of spying. German agents did their job. They got the intel. The failure was a failure of acceptance. A total cognitive collapse at the highest levels. An inability to process facts that contradicted a fanatical ideology. The Nazi leadership, blinded by their own propaganda, simply could not accept the numbers. They were defeated not by a magical secret weapon, but by simple arithmetic. They were buried by an avalanche of steel and aluminum, forged by the very people they disdained. Men and women of all backgrounds working together in a free society. The spies were right. The Admiral was right. March 17, 1943, was the day the truth arrived in Berlin, and nobody in power was willing to listen. Stories like this show that history often turns on moments far from the battlefield. In quiet offices where a single piece of paper can change everything. In the end, the story of Willow Run is more than a cool World War II fact. It is a chilling look at how any government, any group, or even any one of us can be blinded by what we want to believe. The Third Reich was not defeated because it lacked information. It was defeated because its leaders chose to trust their prejudices over the facts. They built a world view on the sands of racial mythology. And when the tide of mathematical reality came crashing in, the entire structure was washed away. The conflict between the Abwehr's grim reports and the arrogant dismissals of Hitler and Goering was a battle for the soul of the German war effort, a battle between evidence and fantasy. Fantasy won, and in doing so doomed the entire enterprise. Willow Run, meanwhile, stands as a monument to the very things Nazism wanted to destroy. The power of a diverse, free society to mobilize and innovate on a scale totalitarianism could never match. The factory floor was a microcosm of the Allied cause. Chaotic, imperfect, but when united, capable of the impossible. And so the legacy of that day in March 1943 echoes through time. It is a stark reminder that the most formidable walls are not made of stone and concrete. They are the walls we build in our own minds. If you want more hidden stories like this one, subscribe to Last Stand History and turn on notifications so you do not miss our next investigation. It helps a lot if you like this video and share it with anyone else who loves to see how facts beat fantasy. This video is for historical and educational purposes only. It does not glorify war or support any political ideology. Thanks for watching.